Hi, I'm Sean Massey. I'm here to give a little presentation today about how we can use Microsoft, or how we can automate the Microsoft stack using PowerShell and vCenter Orchestrator. So, just a really quick introduction here. Talking about why we should automate. It's really there, for a couple of reasons. Simple. You should automate to simplify routine or complex tasks. You don't want to be doing the same thing over again, having to follow the same 10 or 20 step task list manually each time, especially if those tasks get rather complex. It's also good if you want to start providing self-service features to other users and or administrators in your environment. And all of this, of course, makes your life much, much easier. So why use PowerShell to automate? Well, in the Microsoft world, it's kind of like building with Legos. Each of your commandlets is like a different type of Lego brick. And as you build your scripts, you can kind of put them together to make all sorts of interesting new creations, different buildings, so to speak. Now, the really cool thing about PowerShell is almost every Microsoft product out there today, including all the Microsoft Online services, can be automated using PowerShell. And for things that aren't Microsoft, most vendors are starting to provide third-party plugins or REST APIs that you can use with PowerShell to automate. And finally, PowerShell is almost self-documenting. When you look at your commands, git-vm, you know that you're looking up a VM in a system, or git-ad user, you're pulling a user out of your Active Directory. There's no complex code that you need to put together to do a simple little function that you would have to comment later on. So then why use vCenter Orchestrator? Well, in the environment that I work in, going back to December, we didn't have a job scheduling system. We didn't have any sort of automation tool. So when we had to do an Exchange upgrade and move from Exchange 2007 to 2010, we were doing it with PowerShell and Task Scheduler to try to coordinate all the jobs, and it didn't work really well. So we started looking at vCenter Orchestrator, and there's a couple things we found. It's very flexible and very extensible. Orchestrator has its own set of plugins that you can use to add new features to it, and it's also really easy to deploy. You either drop an appliance into your virtual environment, or it's installed automatically with vCenter on Windows. So it's not really hard to set up, it's already there. It's also very easy to build workflows. All your workflows are designed graphically within the vCenter Orchestrator client. So you just drag and drop the components you need, do a little bit of configuration, and you have a workflow up and running. And finally, it's included in all your vCenter licensing SKUs. So you have Orchestrator with you, you're licensed to use it if you buy vSphere. So before you can automate Microsoft stacks using VCO, you need to have it set up. And you really need to have the latest version of vCenter Orchestrator, which is currently 5.5.1. And the reason you need to have the latest one is they changed the plugin architecture on it. So if you want to use the latest PowerShell plugin, you need to have the latest version of Orchestrator. You also need to have it configured for KERBEROS authentication. If you're using the appliance, it's not part of your Active Directory domain by default. And when you're working with PowerShell against remote Windows systems, you need to have KERBEROS configured. Now, Mike Preston has a great blog series out on his blog on how to configure VCO, the appliance. He covers how to cover KERBEROS authentication in that, so if you're interested in setting it up, I'd recommend taking a look at it. You also need to have the latest PowerShell plugin for Orchestrator. Version 1.04 has support for 2012 R2 and PowerShell 4.0. I also like using a Windows jump box to execute the scripts, and the reason for that is it's much easier to manage your connections, and you have one place to store your scripts as opposed to trying to manage multiple server connections and multiple locations for your scripts. And finally, with the jump box, you need to have scripts designed to work against remote systems, and Microsoft makes that very easy to do. So what about KERBEROS? Why do we need to have KERBEROS authentication configured? And what is the big issue with it? Well, when you configure KERBEROS with Orchestrator and you run from the appliance, you're using Windows or WinRM to remote into a jump box to execute your scripts. So if you write a script against that to execute from that box and try to hop into another box using commandlet remoting of some sort, you're going to get all sorts of errors. And that's because of the KERBEROS double hop issue. It's basically does not allow you to pass a KERBEROS authentication token onto a third system when you're remoted into that second one. It's much more complicated than that, but there's a great discussion on the TechNet blogs on how to on exactly what it is. But there is a workaround for it with PowerShell, and it doesn't require using SSH. Now, a couple months back, I did a vBrownBag where I talked about something similar to this, and to get around the KERBEROS double hop issue, I was using SSH to execute those commandlets for Exchange. But I found there's a better way to do it using implicit remoting. So to get around this KERBEROS double hop issue, you have to store your credentials somewhere locally on your system. Now, Microsoft has made this somewhat secure in that whenever you use the get-credentials command to store your username and password for a commandlet, you can't pull that password back out. It's encrypted with a hash. So you can take that hash, store it to a file, and then add a key file to it so that if you wanted to reuse it again, you can just pull it back in and recreate the credential. So what I like to do for this is I create a bunch of service accounts with the limited access that they need. So if I'm doing stuff against Active Directory or Exchange, I'll have an account specific for that. If I'm doing something against vCENTER, I'll have a separate account for it, and so on, to try to keep these accounts as least privileged as possible. So if somebody does get a password for them, they're limited in what sort of damage they could do. Then I create a very secure folder on that machine, and I put the credential files and the keys in there. That folder's locked down to domain admins and the service account that executes WinRM itself. The steps for creating and storing the passwords to disk is a blog by that I have linked up here. It's a great resource if you want to get more details on how to do that. So what happens is now that you have these credentials stored on your machine, whenever you execute a script that needs to remotely access a third system, you just load that credential in at the beginning. It'll pull the file, it'll reconstruct the credential, and then you'll be able to use the -credential commandlet when it's supported to access a third system of any sort. So here's a little sample on how you can do that. Now on how you can pull that credential in and reconstitute it. This is the least secure matter of doing it. This is where it stores it as an encrypted password hash on your local machine, and then you use a key file to pull it back together. As you can see, we're basing the key files on the account name that we need to access. It's recreating the secured string and then recreating the credentials. Now, there is another method for doing this where it actually uses a certificate to encrypt the whole stack. I haven't tried that method yet, but that would actually provide additional security, because if you don't have the certificate, you won't be able to decrypt the password. So then, here's an example. Now, once we have that password reconstituted and have those credentials, we can then use this to remote into other systems. So here's an example of how we could connect to Exchange to run commands against Microsoft Exchange remotely from our jump box. Now, we can do the same with vCENTER, we can do the same with Microsoft Online Services, and in fact, we have something running in our environment every night that goes out, updates our licensing using methods similar to this. Finally, when you use the new PS session, You obviously have to import the session to the local system to get those commandlets, and you're basically running the commandlets on your machine instead of having to install the modules themselves. Now, you can also use this with 2012 R2. It's actually kind of cool, is they've added a whole bunch of new commandlets, and there's a new remoting technology called sim sessions, and this gives you a whole bunch of flexibility with automation. You can use these commandlets to do some really cool things. So if you have a routine process you use for, provisioning Exchange or SQL, and you have to add multiple disks, you can actually go into vCenter, add those disks, pop into Windows using a sim session, and then automatically configure those disks with the names that you need them to have, with the format them with the correct block size, mount them up with whatever mounting format that you use. So what we do in our environment for SQL is we actually we'll create all these disks using PowerShell, and as we create the disk, we'll hop into our SQL server. We'll detect that new disk because it's not formatted, it's not initialized, and we'll run through a routine process that creates them and mounts them up as mount points for our SQL servers. So, and that kind of wraps up how we use Orchestrator and PowerShell.